What's up, YouTube? I'm FirestarW, and I'm here with one of the most typical of YouTube videos, the phone review. Now recently I've replaced my aging 2012 Samsung Galaxy S3 with the Sony Xperia XA2 released in 2018. About 6 months ago I crawled through the internet and then found the LineageOS subreddit where the best LineageOS phone is a common topic, and important for me as well, since running custom software such as LineageOS is important to me on a phone. There I found a useful spreadsheet that let me filter by the things that I wanted, such as a phone newer than 2014, SD card slot, decent Bluetooth, headphone jack, a mid-range price, and I managed to find this titular phone, which struck out to me. It was very striking in its appearance. The only other phones that really appealed to me either just didn't make the cut at all, or were the Galaxy S7, which I was on the fence about getting, but then this phone, the XA2, went on sale about New Year's when I got my phone. So that sort of tipped me over the edge. The pros of this outweighed the pros of the S7. I wanted a new phone with a warranty. The only con I saw from reviews was the camera was a bit meh, but that wasn't the biggest concern for me, so I took the jump. The next thing that happened to me was receiving the box of the phone. Now I can't show you me opening it, that already happened, but what I got was pretty typical. Just the phone, charger, and cable. At this point in time after I unboxed the phone, I did have a LineageOS install and update adventure that I do want to talk about, but I'll go ahead and skip ahead to the present where I have a fully working phone to first talk about the actual phone itself and how I feel about it. The Sony Xperia XA2 is a mid-range smartphone released in February of 2018 by Sony, and is the middle sibling with two other phones, part of a family with the XA2 Ultra, which was released in January and has a bigger screen and battery compared to the XA2, and the XA2 Plus being its youngest sibling, released in August of 2018, and is basically a bezel-less XA2 Ultra with an 18:9 aspect ratio screen. I mention these two phones because my experience of this phone should mostly apply to its siblings, since the screen size is the only thing that's different between the three. Speaking of size, the physical size of this phone is 142 by 70 by 9.7 millimeters, features a 5.2-inch screen, and weighs about 171 grams. The size seems about average to me, decently heavier and slightly larger than the naked Galaxy S3, but somewhat lighter than the thick battery pack. The XA2 is available in a wide variety of colors, from silver, black, pink, and blue, all very nice. The phone itself features an aluminum frame, giving it a nice premium feel in your hands, but not completely premium as the back is plastic. Overall, it is a much nicer feel, say, compared to an all-plastic Galaxy S3. Now the size and shape of this phone do make it a bit slippery. It's occasionally slipped out of my pocket. If we look at the right side of this phone, we find three buttons: the volume rocker, power button, and a camera button. The volume rocker is in a nice comfortable position for me, one that I'm familiar with from the Galaxy S3 in the top right. The power button, if we take a look from a different angle, is slightly recessed compared to the other two buttons, which makes it easier to feel out and hard to press accidentally. On the bottom, you'll find the camera button, which by default activates the camera only when you long press the button, and then lets you snap pictures while the camera is on. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a way to rebind this under LineageOS. You'll have to use an external app to do this. Looking back at the back of the phone, you have a fingerprint sensor, which I can't actually comment on since I don't use the fingerprint sensor. So instead, let's take a look at the side of the phone. It has the SIM card and SD card slot. Or I guess it's a tray, really. Now, I was kind of expecting it to be more of like the old slot that maybe you'd see on like the side of MP3 players that I'm used to, but it seems like that trays are what all phones use, so it's a bit of a bummer for me. I like to be able to easily push in and out my SD cards, and since this is a tray, what you have to do, I'll demonstrate, is you have to pull the tray out, which then drops the SIM card out. Then dig out the SD card tray with like a paper clip, which is what I have, or something else, And then you can get the SD card out, which then I can put in my USB reader and sync or whatever. But then if I want to put it back in, I gotta put the tray in, pop it back in, then pop the SIM card in, and then, oh, what's this? Android says it needs to reboot before I can get SIM service again, so a little unfortunate inconvenience there. Now I'll also note that in place of the SD card slot, I'm not sure how it physically looks, but there are dual SIM models of this phone. And honestly, from what I've read, I wouldn't recommend using dual SIM with this phone in LineageOS. What I've seen, you have to configure your dual SIMs in the stock ROM, then install, but that means you can't reconfigure with your phone with LineageOS. That sounds kind of jank, so don't do it. Going back to the idea of putting an SD card in your phone, I think that is probably pretty essential for this phone. The internal storage is 32 gigabytes, and that's the only option available, so I think for modern standards that's a bit anemic. That is actually double of what my old S3 had, so it seems kind of big for me, but I can see it getting full pretty quickly as well. Now you can only use an SD card as external storage with this phone, which is fine for me, but if you want to use it as like internal storage, there's not going to go into huge technical details, but there's a bug that Google has acknowledged exists where it just doesn't work. Moving on to the bottom of the phone, there is a single USB-C port for charging and connectivity. So nice new to me port, less bendy, easier to plug in. And subject to charging, the phone supports Qualcomm Quick Charge 3.0. Yes, it actually does work with the ROM, just recently got fixed as of this video. I don't use it though. I do use a 2.0 amp charging port though, and that takes about 2 hours from 20% to charge. And from 100% on this 3300 milliamp battery that this phone has, that gives me about 2 to 3 days of normal use, down to 20% of battery. So normal use for me is I use low brightness, I disable any connectivities I'm not using, and maybe browsing the web using Twitter for an hour or a little more, watching videos for an hour or a little more a day, and then my phone goes off at night. So I'd give both the size of the battery and Android P credit for the decent battery life. However, I will note that LineageOS is missing adaptive battery support from Android P, so it's not doing everything it could to make battery life as good as possible. This is actually a really strange thing to point out though, because in the old January nightlies, I did have adaptive battery in Android P. So it might be that there's some legal reasons that they can't actually use Google's AI, or it's a hardware issue, I don't know, but you don't have adaptive battery with LineageOS right now on this phone as of this video. Either way, your battery life should be, I think, above average on this phone. However, I haven't used any other modern phones, so maybe 2 to 3 days with my type of usage is pretty normal. I don't know. For wireless connectivity, this phone has Wi-Fi up to wireless in, Bluetooth 5.0, which features the aptX HD codec, a decently better wireless range than my old phone, and the realization I need to update my other devices in order to actually take advantage of at least aptX connectivity. The phone also supports NFC for wireless Google Pay and other cool things. And even an FM radio, which is kind of a cool feature to have when you're tired of your playlists and your own music. Now you need to use headphones in order to have an antenna, probably due to interference issues within the phone. And FM radio, no, I think it's pretty nice when you actually have good local radio, which I did used to have at the old college town I used to live in. And while where I live now still also has college radio, it's not as good as where I used to live. Here it's got a robot doing the playlist half the time. Speaking of music, for playing said music without headphones, on the bottom of the phone there is a single mono speaker right next to the USB port, and it has fairly decent sound for a single speaker. The speaker itself's in a good spot for portrait, landscape, setting the phone on a table, which is better than my old S3, which had a much tinier speaker that sat in the back so you couldn't set it on a table. However, my expectations for phone speakers are way higher since I own an NVIDIA Shield tablet, which best mobile speakers, but I mean, there's bezels, so put speakers there. That's what this phone could do as well, but unfortunately, this phone doesn't do it. Almost no phones, except for like the Razer phone does it? Come on. Now, while what this phone has for your ears is a little disappointing to me, what the phone has for my eyes and hands is a lot better, being a 5.2-inch 1080p IPS screen. Now, I went from a 4.8-inch 720p AMOLED screen on the Galaxy S3 to this, so the resolution bump lets me make out details in the photos I take, and lets me watch higher res video as well. Now, I honestly never realized that the Galaxy S3 had an AMOLED display, and I always use low brightness, so I don't really notice sort of a picture quality difference between the two phones, and I didn't use ambient display either, so yeah, I really don't miss any of the AMOLED stuff. I'd say the screen works for my eyes, and it works for my fingers. I'm going to show a different camera angle now, so you can see the curves at the edge of the screen. This doesn't really affect how you see the stuff on the screen, but what it does do is it makes putting a screen protector on this phone basically impossible. You probably have noticed by now that I have a screen protector on this phone. This is actually the stock screen protector that came with it in the box, which says a lot. So Sony themselves are showing, hey, you can't protect the screen fully, and any screen protector you try to buy will have the same problem. Now, the only thing you can do to protect the screen all the way is get a flip cover. Sony does have a nice official one, but otherwise, if you want to rock it sorta naked like me, you'll have to do this. Now, I'll briefly go over the internals of this phone. I don't want to go very in depth because the generation gap is a pretty big difference for me. I went from 4-core on the S3 to an 8-core, about 1 GHz to 2 GHz. And for RAM, a little less of a jump, 2 GB to 3 GB, but the main thing for me is that Google Maps went from being barely usable to actually running. I can watch 1080p video now, I can run modern games. The phone runs fast enough for my standards. Now, I'm going to dig into one of the bigger features of a phone that needs a bit more time to get into, the camera. With the amount of knowledge of a point-and-shoot user, the rear camera is a whopping 23 megapixels. That's advertised by Sony. And the front-facing sensor is an 8 megapixel one. Now, since this review is about the LineageOS experience with this phone, and this makes this the only operating system I've used this phone with, my critique of the camera is going to be a bit different than those using the stock Sony ROM. You see, for most, if not all phones, the camera is one of the major components of the phone that has proprietary algorithms and such tied to it, meaning that custom software isn't going to get 100% the same quality from the camera as the handset maker's ROM. Additionally, for Sony phones specifically, when you unlock the bootloader to install a custom ROM, you wind up deleting DRM keys, which one of the function of them is enabling camera functionality. In fact, on the XA2, I think that is all that DRM key deletion impacts. According to one XDA poster, it just limits your ISO sensitivity options and low light functions, so Sony isn't making you cripple the camera too much. Apparently it is a lot worse for Sony flagship users though. Despite this amount of handicap the camera is described to having, due to LineageOS, it isn't that bad, as my examples with 3 different camera apps should hopefully show. It doesn't really wow me, it doesn't feel like a huge leap from the Galaxy S3, but the resolution is higher. Note that it is limited to 20.2 megapixels in custom ROMs though, but it's still larger than what I've had before. I can make out more details in pictures compared to the Galaxy S3, but there's just something off. Pictures don't seem as sharp and as clear as I feel higher-end smartphone cameras probably are. With the at the time current version of LineageOS, the pictures overall are a bit on the noisy side, probably due to missing algorithms, and show hints of the overexposure problem that review outlets mentioned when this phone launched with the stock ROM. For the camera apps, I'd say that the LineageOS camera app looks slightly worse than the Google camera from the Play Store, or Open Camera with either camera API. I will note one of the things that has improved with LineageOS updates is the camera though. Before a recent one, pictures were a lot worse. Now phone cameras do video and not just stills, so here's some examples of the rear camera, which is capable of doing video at 4K 30fps or 1080p 60fps. A nice step up from my old phone, which only did 720p 60fps or 1080p 30. Recording video also records audio, and I'll now mention that this phone has dual microphones in the ends of the phone for stereo recording. I'll now demo it here with the front-facing camera video. Here's an example video of me with the front-facing camera. Here I am to the left, here I am to the right, back in the center. Now you might have noticed when I said left, I was in your right ear, and vice versa, but this is just due to camera apps not mirroring the microphones with the selfie cam. For front camera video, the audio channels would be correct. For both cameras, I'd say the quality is pretty good. Honestly, it kind of surprised me compared to the stills. I think because the difference between the stills and the video on the S3 was so different. To wrap up my run through of the phone's specs, let's talk about, well, the phone being a phone. How does making a phone call sound? Well, this little ear speaker at the top sounds about alright. Sounds about the same as my old phone, honestly. And there's some random high-pitched squeaks in calls, which I think is more of like a tower or a driver, or it could be a range of issues. Now, right by the earpiece is this black dot that is the proximity sensor, which makes the phone screen go off so you don't accidentally touch the mute button with your face. I do specifically point it out because I didn't know this phone had it for a little bit. The January LineageOS beta actually didn't have a working proximity sensor, but it does work now, so that's good. So from my rundown of the specs, I'd say this phone does all the utility things that I want in a phone pretty good. All the hardware is supported by LineageOS, and I can turn it on pretty quickly, like in 20 seconds as opposed to 5 minutes of my old phone from being turned off. Do quick lookups on the internet, take pictures, do phone calls, listen to music. Don't need it to be a good primary device for browsing the web, watching video, or gaming. I mostly use a PC for that type of stuff. And at the end of the day, when I turn off my phone, it uses about 30-40% battery. Still a bit to go, so I'd say this phone, it does good for me. Now there are some cons to this phone, and one software con that I found is that in the recovery software TWRP, you cannot back up the data partition. Now, apparently this is unfixable, at least for now, and this just highlights sort of some of the weirdness that this phone has due to its smaller popularity and developer base. Now this phone is about in the top 200 in LineageOS statistics. Now this lower popularity probably helped contribute to making my LineageOS install experience a little unpleasant when I first got my phone. It took me about 4 days to get installed, albeit I will say that this isn't all the community software support's fault. This is also Sony's fault, and partially self-inflicted wounds as well. Now to make the long story short, the install instructions were not really completely complete on the internet, but at the same time, I wound up overwriting a lot of stock software and firmware partitions, which made LineageOS working a lot trickier. Eventually I did figure out, hey, I need to get the stock Sony ROM, but Sony's own tools were not quite up to the task, but eventually I did get it working. Eventually did get LineageOS installed. And then I was good until LineageOS 16 went official, and I wanted to upgrade from my unofficial nightlies to the official nightlies. And it turns out Sony's app doesn't actually give you the latest firmware, but hey, at least the maintainer now has instructions for that, so just another hiccup. But yeah, I don't think this is completely all down to just the phone being less popular. I think partially this is just sort of the things you go through when you use a custom ROM on a smartphone sometimes. I think that with the S3, I just didn't update it enough, and it was such an old and classic device that I didn't see these issues, but yeah, just that's what you're in for. Be prepared. Alright, so now it's time for the conclusions. Do I recommend this phone? Well, with the exact same conditions I got this phone, I would recommend it, but this is kind of tricky to present because earlier in February this year, Sony announced a new phone line, the Xperia 1 and Xperia 10, with the 10 being the new mid-range phone, to be released in spring of this year 2019. Yes, the XA2 line lasted for 1 year. Is this really how the phone market is? So this, as of right now, seems to be making the XA2 new availability more scarce, with it only being available new at $350 on Amazon and unavailable at Best Buy, in the US at least. So my situation of this being a good new phone at $200 may not be easily replicable anymore. If you can find this at about $250 USD or lower, and want a good budget LineageOS phone with an SD card slot, headphone jack, larger than average battery, are willing to learn and tweak things as you go, and are okay with a mediocre-ish camera, then this is it. And with that, this is it for the review / first impressions of my phone. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching, peace, and bye.